The date hit me before the tunnel did. February 26, 1870. Not a riot, not a fire, not a financial collapse. A train beneath Broadway. I found it in a brittle newspaper clipping, folded inside the March 1st, 1870 edition of the New York Sun. Sitting in a filing cabinet at the New York Public Library. The ink was faded, the headline small, but the claim was enormous. A pneumatic subway had just carried passengers under Manhattan, the first subway in New York did not open in 1904. It opened in 1870, and almost no one remembers. The idea felt impossible. A city still lit by gas lamps. Horses crowding the streets. Tammany Hall at full power. And yet, beneath all of it, a train gliding silently under Broadway. Like a mechanical ghost. The silence around it felt louder than the machine itself. Act 1 begins there. With a contradiction, because when I started researching early New York transit, I wasn't looking for buried railways. I was looking at sanitation reform, cholera outbreaks, street congestion. But the object led me elsewhere. A circular brick tunnel, 312 feet long, 8 feet in diameter, built in secret. The artifact that pulled me in wasn't a map. It was a stock certificate, issued by the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company, dated February 5, 1870, printed in ornate script, promising revolution. Alfred Ely Beach believed New York could be moved underground. The stakes were enormous. By 1869, Broadway was gridlocked with horse-drawn omnibuses, and elevated rail debates had stalled in Albany. The city was swelling toward 1 million residents. Disease spread easily. Movement was slow. Profits were at stake. And then, without public vote or official announcement, a tunnel appeared beneath the busiest street in America, like something breathing under. Floorboards. The official story goes like this. Alfred Ely Beach, inventor and publisher of Scientific American, proposed a pneumatic subway using air pressure to move a single passenger car through a short demonstration tunnel. The New York State Legislature had refused him permission to build a full subway line. So he quietly obtained a permit to construct a mail delivery tube beneath Broadway. That's the phrase. Mail delivery tube. Construction began in 1869. Workers labored at night. The tunnel was dug by hand and shielded by a circular iron cutting head. Dirt was removed discreetly. No major street disruptions. No headlines. On February 26, 1870, the Beach Pneumatic Transit opened to the public. For 25 cents, visitors descended into a lavishly decorated underground station at Warren Street. Gas lamps glowed. Frescoes lined the walls. A piano played. The car moved through the tunnel, propelled by compressed air. The ride lasted less than a minute. According to official accounts, it was a novelty, a demonstration, a proof of concept. The project operated for about a year, carrying an estimated 400,000 passengers. Then funding failed. Political resistance from Tammany Hall stalled expansion. By 1873, the tunnel was sealed. Eventually, it was destroyed during subway construction in 1912. A curiosity, a note, an experiment that failed. That's the official narrative. And, to be fair, much of it is supported by contemporary sources. The New York Times reported on the opening on February 27, 1870. Scientific American praised the engineering. Beach himself testified before legislative committees, arguing for expansion. But here's what unsettled me. The timeline isn't subtle. 1868, Beach proposes a full underground railway. January 1869. The New York legislature rejects his bill. February 1869, he quietly receives approval for a mail tube. February 1870. A functioning passenger subway opens. March 1871. Beach petitions for expansion again. April 1873. The panic of 1873 looms. 1874, the tunnel is sealed, which brings me to the politics. Speaking of Tammany Hall, There's a related anomaly. William M. Tweed, Boss Tweed, controlled much of New York's political machinery during this period. Elevated rail companies were closely tied to powerful interests. Street-level transit meant visible franchises, patronage jobs, contracts. An underground system threatened existing investments. In the minutes of the New York State Assembly Transportation Committee dated March 9, 1871, preserved at the New York State Archives in Albany, Beach's expansion proposal is discussed. The language is cautious, supportive even, but the vote never materializes. Instead, elevated rail projects accelerate. The timing is almost theatrical. Let me be fair to the official narrative. The Panic of 1873 devastated investment markets. Financing large infrastructure projects became nearly impossible. Beach's backers withdrew. Public enthusiasm waned. Cities changed direction all the time. That's not conspiracy. That's economics. But here's what matters. The tunnel wasn't dismantled. Immediately it remained, buried in plain sight. In 1912, during construction of the Broadway subway line near City Hall, workers reportedly broke into the old beach tunnel. Accounts vary. Some say the structure was intact. Others describe only remnants. What troubles historians is not that the tunnel failed. It's how thoroughly it vanished from civic memory. There were no preservation efforts. No commemorative plaques. No serious expansion attempts revived until decades later. Why? Let's start with the numbers. 400,000 passengers in roughly a year. In a city of under 1 million, for a single-block demonstration ride costing 25 cents. That's not trivial curiosity traffic. That suggests sustained public interest. The car was comfortable. The station, elegant. Contemporary descriptions speak of chandeliers, upholstered seats, even a fountain. That's not a crude prototype. That's a statement. Speaking of statements, Beach was not a marginal tinkerer. He was the editor of Scientific American, a respected inventor. He testified before Congress in other matters. He wasn't operating in obscurity. So why did the city wait another 34 years until October 27, 1904, to open its first official subway line under the Interborough Rapid Transit Company? 34 years. That's not hesitation. That's generational delay. Maybe it was purely political gridlock. Elevated rail interests fighting underground proposals? Competing engineering philosophies. Legitimate safety concerns about tunneling beneath dense infrastructure maybe, but the pattern indicates something else. Consider this. In 1872, the New York Tribune reported that Beach's tunnel could be extended to Central Park for approximately $5 million. A significant sum, yes, but not unimaginable for a booming metropolis. At the same time, the city was spending heavily on public works projects tied to political machines. The Tweed Courthouse alone ballooned to over $12 million in costs. Money existed. Priorities were chosen. And then there's the permit. Beach's initial approval was for a mail tube, a narrow administrative category that allowed him to bypass broader legislative scrutiny. He built something much larger than a mail conduit, creative interpretation, or quiet workaround. The New York Board of Aldermen records from 1869, stored at the Municipal Archives on Chambers Street, show minimal public debate over subterranean transit during the exact month's excavation. Occurred almost as if no one noticed, but they must have. A circular iron shield boring beneath Broadway would have required coordination, laborers, supplies, engineering oversight, and yet contemporary outrage is sparse. That's not invisibility. That's selective attention. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but the repetition stands out. Innovator proposes. Reform, political resistance stalls it. Workaround emerges. Public interest grows. Institutional. Backing evaporates. Infrastructure disappears. And the city waits decades to implement a similar idea under different leadership. That's not failure. That's redirection. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The part that keeps me up at night isn't that a subway was built early. It's that it worked. By multiple contemporary accounts, the pneumatic propulsion system operated smoothly. The engineering was sound. The public responded positively. So what changed? In 1873, the financial panic certainly damaged investor confidence. But other large-scale projects resumed within years. Elevated rail lines expanded aggressively in the 1870s and 1880s. Underground transit did not. Speaking of elevated lines, they were noisy, obtrusive, profitable, visible symbols of industrial power slicing through. Neighborhoods and underground system would have centralized control differently. Reduced street franchises. Altered revenue streams. Maybe the resistance was practical. Or maybe it was structural. I don't have answers, only patterns. The beach tunnel sits at the center of a question larger than itself. Was New York simply not ready for an underground city in 1870? Or was someone else not ready to lose control of how the city moved? The archive gives us fragments, newspaper clippings, legislative minutes, a handful of illustrations. No surviving photographs of the original interior station that can be definitively authenticated. Some accounts contradict others, and the tunnel itself is gone, buried, destroyed, absorbed into later construction. What remains is a date, February 26th, 1870. And a train that ran beneath Broadway long before. It was supposed to. The timeline isn't subtle, and the silence around it feels deliberate. But that's only the first layer, because once you pull that thread, the city begins to look different. The beach tunnel was not the only buried idea in 19th century New York. It was part of a larger conversation about who controlled movement, who profited from congestion, and who decided which futures were allowed to materialize. I found this while researching something else entirely, in the annual report of the New York Rapid Transit Commission, dated December 31st, 1891. Preserved at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. There is a brief reference to earlier pneumatic experiments beneath Broadway. No elaboration. No detailed engineering assessment. Just a passing acknowledgement, as if it were folklore. But here's what matters. By 1891, underground tunneling technology had advanced dramatically. London had opened the Metropolitan Railway in 1863. Chicago was experimenting with freight tunnels in the 1890s. Globally, the idea of subterranean transit was no longer radical, and yet New York, the densest, fastest-growing city in America, delayed. The timing is almost theatrical. In 1894, New York voters finally approved a referendum supporting the construction of a municipal subway. 10 years later, in 1904, the first official line opened, 34 years after. Beach. Which brings me to the question no one fully answers. If the engineering proof existed in 1870, what exactly took so long? Let me be fair to the official narrative again. Subway construction at scale requires enormous capital, coordinated political will, and technological refinement. Beach's tunnel was short, demonstrative. Expanding it beneath miles of Manhattan bedrock posed different challenges. There were legitimate fears about ventilation, structural collapse, and interference with building foundations. Those concerns were real. But here's the pattern. When elevated, railroads faced opposition in the 1870s, lawsuits over noise, property devaluation, public outrage. They expanded anyway. Court battles dragged on. But steel tracks kept rising above the streets. Resistance did not stop them. It slowed them. Underground transit, by contrast, stalled almost completely. That's not equal friction. That's asymmetry. Speaking of asymmetry, consider ownership structures. Elevated lines were largely private enterprises. Investors controlled shares. Political alliances ensured favorable franchises. Revenue flowed visibly and immediately. An underground municipal subway threatened to shift that balance. Public ownership models circulated in proposals throughout the 1880s that would have meant different contracts, different oversight, different profit distribution. Maybe it was just Capitalism, defending itself maybe, but the repetition continues. Innovative. System emerges. Power structures hesitate. Alternative. More controllable infrastructure expands. Original innovation fades from collective memory. And once you see that rhythm, it echoes elsewhere. The part that unsettles me most is not that the beach tunnel closed. It's how thoroughly it was remedied. In later histories, it becomes quaint. A curiosity. A charming Victorian experiment. The narrative shrinks it, but contemporary descriptions from 1870 describe something ambitious. The station featured a grand waiting room, ornate decorations, intentional spectacle. Beach wasn't testing a pipe. He was staging a vision of the future. That's not a toy. That's a prototype for a different city. The timeline isn't. Subtle. 1870 functional underground. Demonstration. 1873. Financial panic and political. Turbulence. 1880s elevated rail. Dominance. 1809 for public referendum 1904. Official subway opens under a different corporate structure. The pattern suggests delay, not incapacity, and delay benefits someone. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist, but the absence feels engineered. There is no preserved entrance to the beach station. No commemorative marker on Broadway at Warren Street, explaining that New Yorkers once descended there in 1870. No. Reconstructed exhibit in the earliest subway museums beyond small. References, the archive exists, but it whispers, and that whisper contrasts sharply with how cities usually celebrate firsts. First bridges. First, skyscrapers. First, electric grids. Those are monuments. This first was buried. Literally, when construction crews rediscovered parts of the tunnel in 1912 near the City Hall station. Reports describe it as a relic encountered during progress. An obstacle. Something in the way. That phrasing matters. Not a predecessor. Not a foundation. An obstruction. That's not neutral language. That's narrative framing. Speaking of framing, Beach himself died in 1896. He did not live to see New York's official subway open. His obituary in the New York Times on January 2nd, 1896, mentions his inventions and editorial work, but his subway experiment receives only modest attention. Subscribe to my channel.